Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome back to the Friendship Quilt Along. So today we are quilting our very first block, and I want to keep it really simple. We're going to be doing some walking foot quilting as we stitch in the ditch, and then some ruler foot quilting as we do some echo ditching. It's super simple. You can do all of this quilting with your walking foot. You can do all of it with a ruler foot or all of it in free motion. It's totally up to you. So let's get started. First, stitching in the ditch. So let's get started stitching in the ditch, and I'm going to use a walking foot for this, so I've attached it to my machine. I do like to use a tool, it's called a queen size supreme slider. This just helps my quilt to glide and slide a little bit easier over this machine table. And I have placed this here off the side of my walking foot because I'm going to use those feed dogs. I want to make sure not to cover them up. So I've set the slider here off the side. I have some Machinigers quilting gloves on my hands that just helps me get a good grip of the quilt. And then over here I have set my machine to have a middle straight stitch. So the needle's in the center position and it's just going to do a straight stitch. And then I've lowered my stitch length down to 2 millimeters, and that's just going to produce a nice, tight, consistent stitch. All right, so now I'm going to slide the quilt into the machine underneath that foot, make sure to drop it down. And then I want to bring up my bobbin thread. And this is one of those techniques I think is just really important to master because it ensures that the front of your quilt is going to look as good as the back. I'm grabbing my hand wheel over here and I'm going to rotate the needle all the way down so it goes down into the machine and then it comes all the way back up again to the point that the needle is starting to drop back down again. And then I give my top thread a gentle tug. And what that does is it brings my bobbin thread up to the surface of the quilt. And I want to do that every time I start stitching so that way I'm sure that the bobbin thread's not going to make a mess on the back of the quilt. So now with that taken care of, I just tuck those thread tails underneath the foot and I start stitching. And this is walking foot quilting, and with a walking foot, the machine and the foot are doing the work for you. So all I have to do is just simply make sure that I'm guiding the quilt and steering it back and forth so that I stay right in that ditch. And the ditch is the seam line. That's the line between the different pieces. And actually, now that I take a look at those stitches, I think that looks a little bit big. So I'm going to lower my stitch length down to 1.5 millimeters. And that's the thing, at any point in time, if you're looking at your stitches with walking foot quilting and going, I don't know, that kind of looks a little chunky, or it looks a little small, you can always adjust that because a walking foot uses the feed dogs on your machine. It uses that setting, your stitch length setting actually controls the size and shape of your stitch. So if you wanted to zigzag, you could zigzag with the walking foot if you wanted to. But as you can see here, I am just very carefully shifting the quilt around and trying to stay right in that ditch. And this is the thing, with walking foot quilting, you always have to be facing the way that you are stitching because this foot and this style of quilting, you always have to have the quilt going through the machine, just the way the machine is designed to be used. You know, how we piece, our patchwork blocks, how we sew, we have to make sure that we're always stitching in that same direction. So that's the one tricky thing, is that it's going to be a lot of direction changes. And for that, you want to just drop your needle in the down position. And then if you have to, some walking foot put a lot of pressure on the quilt, you can always lift the foot, rotate it around. You can see I'm just rolling up the quilt here, just getting it into the arm of the machine, rolling it up so it's kind of stays out of my way. I don't want it to be too bulky here. Okay, so I have moved on here and I got a little bit, this is just one of those situations where I need to be right in the ditch and I kind of hopped out a little bit. So what I do is I rotate the hand wheel, lift the needle up, then shift the quilt around so it's exactly where I need it, and then I drop the needle down with the hand wheel again. So if you're ever quilting and it just doesn't quite feel right or you're not in the right location, please understand that you can do that too. You can always lift up that needle and shift things around a little bit as needed. There we go. What I love about this particular machine, I can take one stitch at a time if I need to, so I just tap the foot pedal and it changes it from a needle up to a needle down. Test out your machine and just see if you can do that. It's a really nice thing to be able to do. and it helps you maintain control over your stitching. So as you can see here now, I am stitching around my star shape. I'm just stitching around these points. And every time I change my line, every time that I change direction, I have to go on ahead and rotate the quilt around completely. So let's talk a little bit more about walking foot quilting. This style is really good for beginners because I can take my hands off the quilt, and I want you to see, if I continue to run the machine, it will continue to feed the quilt forward. And really all I need to do is just a gentle, just a gentle wiggle back and forth in order to make sure that I stay right on that line. But basically the machine is doing the work for you. So really my hands here on the quilt, I'm steering a little bit, I'm shifting it, but really what I'm doing is flattening out the quilt, making sure I'm not going to stitch a pleat, making sure that that fabric's staying nice and smooth, and it's feeding evenly through the machine. Now, the downside of walking foot quilting is it is a little slow, and you can see I'm running my machine at a slow, steady speed. I actually have lowered my speed slider here to kind of a medium speed. That just helps you maintain control. You know, if you hit your foot on your foot pedal and the machine just takes off on you, chances are you're not going to stitch very pretty stitches into your quilt. So having the ability to lower your speed can really help. And then a walking foot, you got to remember, it's designed to walk. It's designed to go relatively slowly. So you want to just give it time, give it the ability to feed your quilt forward. And if you start noticing that your stitches are getting big, it might be because you're trying to push too hard against your hands. Go up onto your fingertips and just do a light fingertip pressure, or even just one finger, wiggling the quilt back and forth to get it in the right position, because it's really easy to get a little heavy-handed with this. You got to let the feed dogs and the walking foot do the work here. Now I am using a gray thread. This is Isocord Sterling, and it is showing up in these stitches, and this is one of those things that you might want to change up. I'm wanting you to see my stitches. I'm wanting that to stand out so that way you can clearly see where I've quilted. But if you like the idea of that blending in and tucking down into those ditches and kind of hiding, then definitely use a thread color that blends in with your background fabric color, and that's going to be your best choice. So I'm just going to continue stitching in the ditch. It looks like I ended up right here and I finished up that line. I can actually travel stitch and get my way down to this corner, and that's perfectly allowed, and actually it really helps it to reduce thread breaks when you travel stitch in situations like that, so you can get to the next area and you don't have to stop and break thread and tie up those thread tails in the whole 9 yards. I can just get right down here and keep quilting and go around all the largest points of my star. So that can really save you some time. I do think stitching in the ditch is a great technique for many beginners, and for me included. I stitched many of my beginning quilts in the ditch, and that's how I quilted them. And I'll be honest, if you quilted all of these stars in the ditch, that would be plenty of quilting for your Scrappy Star block. You don't need to do more quilting than that. In many cases, stitching in the ditch is plenty. So don't diss it. Don't feel like it's too simple. Or it's too beginner level. It is actually a little on the tricky side to stay right exactly perfectly in the ditch all the way down the line. As you probably have seen, I wobble ever so slightly in and out of that ditch. I try to keep my wobbles on the colorful fabric side, just simply so that way it's a little bit less noticeable when I hop out, when I'm stitching with this contrasting thread. But yeah, the main benefit here is just that the walking foot does the feeding for you. It does that feeding. It pushes it through the machine. I can let go of it, and other than a little gentle nudge in the right direction one way or the other, that's pretty much all you have to do with this style of quilting. So I'm going to do echo ditching with ruler foot quilting. So the first thing I've done is put a ruler foot on my machine. This is a special type of darning foot that allows you to use rulers. It has a very high base, so I can press a ruler against the foot and use that as a guide. And when I do this, I'm pressing and holding the ruler flat to the quilt and pushing the whole thing through the machine. And I have added some little grips. These are true grips to the back of my ruler that stops it from slipping. And this is one of the rulers that I've designed with Grace Company. We have them available in 2 different thicknesses. This thinner type that's really great for low shank sewing machines like this one. We also have thicker rulers that are designed for high shank machines or long arms. So what I'm going to do to get started, first I want to talk about machine settings. I still have my machine in that straight stitch in the center position, but I have lowered my stitch length to 0. What this does is it basically stops the feed dogs from moving. Basically now the feed dogs are just going to bounce up and down, but they're really not going to be feeding against the quilt. And I've also covered them. I've taken that queen size supreme slider and I've shifted it over so it's now covering my machine bed. Now with time, yes, having your feed dogs up will kind of chew up this area of the slider a little bit, but it's really not bad. As long as you take care of your slider really well, you make sure to keep this pink side nice and lint free. Just take it off the machine and take it to your sink and rinse it off every once in a while. Then it's not going to shift and it's going to stay in really great shape. But before you get used to using it, if you're just getting started and you're just trying the slider, make sure to tape down these corners with some masking tape because it can shift on you and you end up stitching through it and it's not any fun. And that is a typical beginner mistake. So trust me when I say it is a very common issue to run into and you really don't want to have that happen to your slider. Okay, so that's pretty much it for my settings. Like I said, I just lower my stitch length to 0. I do not drop my feed dogs, and it's up to you. If you want to try that, it's totally up to you. It's perfectly fine to leave your feed dogs up and just simply adjust that stitch length instead. Okay, just like before, I'm going to bring my bobbin thread up to the surface by rotating my hand wheel. Now, one thing that's really important, make sure anytime that you're dropping your foot that it is always, always, always in the down position. As you can see here, the ruler foot has a very high base, and if you're not careful, your needle bar, this bar that holds your needle to the machine, can crash against it and it will probably break your machine. So be very careful about that and always make sure that your foot is in the down position before you begin quilting. Okay, so the major difference between free motion quilting and ruler foot quilting, oops, I meant walking foot quilting. So the major difference between free motion quilting and walking foot quilting is the fact that we can move in all different directions. But in this case, if I take my hands off the quilt and I continue to stitch, the quilt is not going to go anywhere. You have got to push the quilt through the machine. And this is the major difference, is that the machine is not going to be doing any work for you. So, and this is whether you lower your stitch length or you drop your feed dogs, it doesn't matter. Your settings don't matter there. This is just simply how free motion quilting works. And free motion quilting includes ruler foot quilting. These are both the same thing. All right, the major difference is here you can see I'm using that ruler to help guide the stitches. And this is, I gotta say, so much easier just to get the hang of because you've got something to hold on to. And as you can see, I can just slide it and go really nice and slow. And I can focus on keeping my stitches nice and consistent. So let's talk about that, how we form our stitches, because this is a major confusing thing with free motion quilting and ruler foot quilting. And another thing is, I sometimes am undershooting these lines just a little bit, and I want you to see, yes, you can stitch in all different directions, even kind of at this weird backwards angle. I do tend to have the machine set up and rotate the quilt around so that I'm always going through like this. But let me just rotate here and I'll show you. I'll move the ruler and not the quilt. The trickiest thing is just it doesn't feel very natural to hold the ruler that way, and sometimes I notice I get a little bit longer stitches whenever I work at a really weird angle. But you can see, yeah, you don't need to shift the quilt, you don't need to rotate the quilt anymore. You can simply move the ruler instead. So let's talk about our stitches. If you start noticing lots of really tiny stitches, it's probably because you're not moving the quilt very fast or you are running the machine really, really fast. So you're either moving the quilt too slow or you're running the machine too fast. So the solution there, if you're noticing really tiny stitches, is to speed up your hands or slow down your machine. And again, great feature to have is a speed slider. When I taught my husband Josh how to quilt back in 2014, having a speed slider was absolutely essential. He kept that dialed down at a medium speed, and it really helped him get the hang of free motion quilting. Okay, so now let's talk about big stitches. What if you start seeing lots and lots of really huge, big, chunky stitches as you're quilting this echo ditching? Well, in that case, you're probably pushing the quilt just a little bit too fast through the machine, and you're running your machine just a little bit too slow. And here's the thing, this is a balancing kind of ratio. It is actually a combination of those two things that are making your stitches. So if you change both things, you're going to end up with stitches that are the same size. So for big stitches, what you want to do is either speed up your hands and make your hands move just a little bit faster, or you want to, sorry, I got that wrong. Big stitches, you want to slow down your hands so your hands are not moving quite so fast, because the tendency there when you have big stitches is you're kind of shoving the quilt through the machine. You're going just a little bit too fast. So the solution there is to slow down your hands or speed up the machine. The problem is sometimes when we put our foot down, you can hear that, the machine revs up and it kind of makes us a little jumpy, and we tend to, increase the speed of our hands too. Just simply because the machine is a little bit louder. So keep that in mind. You kind of have to ignore the machine sound. It's going to sound loud, but you want to keep your hands moving at a slow, steady speed. Notice how slowly I work around this, and I do rotate quite a bit. It's just the most comfortable for me, I find. To rotate it around, I can see easier. The only time that I often, go like this is whenever I've realized, the ruler wasn't quite in the right position, or I kind of undershot my line just a little bit. So I hope that makes sense about your stitches. Free motion quilting definitely has a learning curve much greater than walking foot quilting, simply for that reason. You've got to learn how to balance those stitches out. And I'll be honest, it's going to be a little ugly, at least in the beginning. You're going to see stitches that get bigger and smaller, and you can see this line of quilting right here as I tie off and hide this thread. You can see that I've got some big stitches and small stitches in there, even just warming up sometimes. I will have lots of different sizes of stitches in my warm-up when I'm first getting started free motion quilting for a day. And sometimes my stitch length will fluctuate. Sometimes I'll be stitching just generally with bigger stitches than usual. And that's the thing you need to understand, is that the settings on your machine have absolutely nothing to do with this. This is all about how you push the quilt through the machine and how fast your foot is making the machine run. That's it. You can play around with settings all day, but it's not going to do anything. It's not going to change anything, because basically you're in control over the size and shape of those stitches when you're free motion quilting. So at this stage, I want to take a second to check in on the design and just explain what my concept is for this first block. I just really want to keep it simple. We're going to aim for minimalism in our quilting with this project because we want our finished quilt to be really soft and squishy. We don't want this to go super stiff. Of course, if you want to go in that angle, of course the sky's the limit. You can continue doing more echo ditching and fill in all of these spaces with more lines of quilting. But if your goal is a really nice king or queen size bed quilt, you're going to want to leave it fairly soft. So at this stage, I've done echo ditching to the inside of that square and around the outside of both big stars. And I also did stitching in the ditch around this entire star. I haven't done any quilting though in this border. The main reason being, if I stitch in the ditch around all of these little points, that's a lot of quilting, and it's going to end up actually being a lot more dense than what I've done over here. It's also unnecessary. I am using a batting in this block that allows quilting up to 10 inches. That means that I can leave more than this much space open on my quilts. I don't have to do any quilting in here. In fact, actually, I could stitch a straight line through this border and call it done. And I've been kind of taking a look at this and just trying to decide what I wanted to do in that border. And I think what I'm going to do is just do some straight lines running through those stars. So I'm thinking a straight line right through the middle, because if I stitched, I could stitch in the ditch, and that would certainly work. I could stitch in the ditch here, but I kind of like the idea of running right through the middle of those half square triangles. All right, so I'm going to pull up thread here in this black batting, and I'm just going to take a few stitches here just to secure it. Whenever I can pull up thread in the batting, I do. It just minimizes the thread break. It makes it a little faster to get started, and I don't have to tie off and bury those thread tails because they're just going to be secured out in that batting area. Okay. So now here on my ruler, I'm using the slice ruler again, and I am lining up the line that is etched on the ruler that is 1 from the edge. And what that's doing is that is adding a 1/4 inch, plus I have a 1/4 inch from the needle to the edge of the foot here. And so that's going to give me a nice 1/2 inch spacing and put me right in the middle of that shape, of that space. So I'm going to get started. And I'm just slowly, carefully pushing the block through the machine. But remember, this is ruler foot quilting, a type of free motion quilting. If I stop pushing it, if I let go of it, you see the machine's not going to do any of the work. So this is entirely up to me. I want to push it through the machine nice and slow and steady. You can hear how I'm running the machine at a nice steady pace too. I'm not, pedal to the metal. It's really nice and slow. And that is helping me keep my stitches nice and consistent. But if you see a little bit of stitch variation, some stitches getting big, some stitches getting small, please understand that that's normal. And there's not really much you can do about it except more practice, and that's really the key. So it is a little bit tricky, I will have to say, lining up that etch line on the ruler with these seam lines. It's not impossible though, so if you need to, just take a minute and just double check yourself. Just make sure that you're lining up the ruler. And the thing about ruler for quilting, everything is really kind of 1/4 inch based. You've got that 1/4 inch from the needle to the edge of the foot, so that makes echo ditching and techniques like that really easy. And then typically there are 1/4 inch lines etched on rulers. That's the way I like to design mine, at least. So now I'm coming up here on the end, and I'm just going to take out that pen and smooth out the block. Just smooth it out nice and flat, and then stitch right off the edge of the batting. Here we go. Right off the edge. And then if you want to stitch back and forth, you can, but really, honestly, we're out in the batting area. You can just clip that off. That's just fine. And when we go to connect our blocks together, do a victory lap, and that secures all of that stitching nice and tight. Okay, so from here, I'm going to pull the block back through the machine, line up again, pretty much the exact same thing, kind of a wash and repeat at this stage. I'll pull up my thread here in the batting area, maybe take a few stitches back and forth, and then I'll line up and make sure that I'm in the right spot. So now I'm lining up the etched line 1 from the edge with the seam line that runs through these stars. So I'm just making sure that's lined up nicely. And when I'm ruler foot quilting, oops, see, this is a tricky thing. Whenever you're starting in the batting, you always want to be really careful. You might not be able to see this because it's black on black, but basically the edge of the quilt started to lip up and push forward. So to solve that, I'm going to stitch back. I'm going to smooth that out with my hands. Really get it nice and smooth, and then now stitch back on top. There we go. Now we're on the right track. You want to be really careful whenever you get started in the batting area that you're not pushing the quilt forward and letting it slip, because that can cause the whole side of your quilt to shift downward. So just watch out for that. That was really good that happened, so I could show it to you. So that's really the only downside to quilting from the edge of your batting, basically off the edge of your quilt and then onto the quilt. That's really the only downside, the only thing you need to watch out for. Okay. So now I'm carefully stitching, keeping my ruler lined up with that seam line. And then as you can just, you might want to even stop and just listen to my machine running. And you can hear just how steady I keep it. I'm not going, speeding up, slowing down. But whenever I stop quilting, I make sure to stop the machine from running. So when my hands stop, I really try and make sure that the machine stops too. And the reason we want to make sure of that is because, again, the machine won't feed the quilt. So if you are stitching in place, like let's say your hands stop moving and you're stitching in place, well, you are still putting stitches in that area, and that can be stitching a knot into your quilt. I call those hesitation knots. They usually cause whenever we are kind of stopping at a design and thinking about where we're going to go next, and that's just allowing the needle to bounce up and down, and that bouncing up and down continues to put thread in your quilt, and that causes a little knot on usually the back of the quilt. Okay, so now I'm smoothing this out again, just making sure that I'm smooth all the way to the edge. And this is one thing that you might want to check in on every once in a while. Just flip up your quilt and take a look at the back and make sure that it's looking good. I really want you to get in the habit of that through this quilt along, to stop and check on things. Stop and take a look at what the back of the quilt looks like. Does it look as good as the front? Are you having any tension issues? Can you see little pops of color? And that is one thing. I really think it's a good idea to use the same color thread in the top and in the bobbin. Basically wind your bobbin with the same thread that you're using on the top, and that will minimize most thread issues, make them a lot less visible. So that's how I'm going to continue this design. I'm just going to stitch more straight lines right through the middle of these areas just to secure those stars down and add that nice straight line texture to this area. Now with the slice ruler, this is easy. I'm just going to continue to line up that edge line that is one from the edge with the seam line within that block, and that will put the ruler foot right in the middle of that space. But a few alternatives. Here is a walking foot, and this walking foot has marks, and they're red marks, and that line right there is actually lined up 1/4 inch from the needle. So if you had a walking foot like this, instead you could simply line up that walking foot so that red line was running basically 1/4 inch from that seam line, kind of the same way that the ruler foot is working. Now, if you have only a darning foot, this is an example of a darning foot that I've modified to make it fit really nicely on my machine. Now, this doesn't have any markings or any guide, and so it's really hard to be able to do nice, evenly spaced, kind of trying to stitch right through the middle of the area. So for this, I would grab a marking pencil, and I just grab a regular ruler and line up the 1/2 inch line with that seam line, and then mark that line right down the middle. And so that's going to give me a marked line that I can follow. And then with free motion quilting, again, you're just going to carefully push the quilt through the machine, trying to maintain an even stitch length. So that's 3 different options for quilting the exact same design. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed learning how to piece and quilt this beautiful Scrappy star block with me this month. You can find the quilt pattern and everything you need to get started with the Friendship Quilt Along at leahday.com/friendship. And I'm actually going to be quilting this block a second time. I'm making 2 blocks every month because I'm making the king size version of this quilt. So next week, I'm going to be quilting the same block on my long arm with a different quilting design. So I hope that you'll come and check out that video. You can find all of the videos linked up together at leahday.com/friendship. Until next time, let's go quilt. And I'm going to be actually quilting this. My arm's hurting. It's very sore. I got a chicken arm. Okay, it's very late, obviously. I'm not gonna be able to stop laughing at myself now. All right, here we go. Click. So that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed this. Okay. Okay. I can't look. There we go. Okay. Click. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed learning how to quilt a Scrappy star plot. Okay. Okay. Here we go. Seriously. Click.